I will explain the process from after the Russo-Japanese War to the Pacific War. In the previous issue, we established the Kwantung Army. This time, I will explain the Nomonhan Incident. The Nomonhan Incident was a military conflict that resulted from a border dispute between Manchukuo, the Soviet Union, and Mongolia. This was a pivotal battle that changed Japan's subsequent war strategy. I will explain the events leading up to the battle, the details of the battle, and the post-war handling of the battle. In this article, I will explain the circumstances leading up to the battle and the first Nomonhan Incident. In 1932, Manchukuo was established with Puyi, the last Qing emperor, as emperor. This was a puppet state of Japan, orchestrated by the Kwantung Army. In 1924, the Socialist People's Republic of Mongolia was established in Mongolia with assistance from the Soviets. The borders between Mongolia Manchukuo and Soviet Manchukuo had not been established prior to the founding of Manchukuo. In addition, the Soviets did not recognize Manchukuo as a country, and discussions had not even begun to demarcate the border. Regarding the border between Mongolia and Manchukuo, Mongolia claimed a hilly area 20 kilometers east of the Khalkha River, which had divided Inner Mongolia and Outer Mongolia since ancient times. In contrast, Manchukuo in Japan claimed the Harul River as their border. As a result of these differing claims, small-scale conflicts were constantly occurring around the border. After 1935, these conflicts became large-scale. One of the reasons for this was the Soviet Union's increasingly hardline diplomatic stance. Stalin, who had risen to the top of the Soviet Union in the 1920s, began the Great Purge of the 1930s, eliminating all political opponents. 1935 was only the middle of the Great Purge, but Stalin could afford to look abroad. In 1936, Mongolia and the Soviet Union signed the Soviet-Mongolian Mutual Assistance Protocol. This provided for Soviet security guarantees for Mongolia. The virtual enemies were in effect Manchukuo and Japan. Based on this agreement, Stalin stationed a large Soviet force inside Mongolia. Japan was highly alarmed by this Soviet move. In order to approach Hitler, who disliked communism, and to check the Soviets, Japan concluded the German-Japanese Anti-Comintern Pact in 1936. In 1937, a full-scale war between China and Japan broke out, triggered by the Rural Bridge Incident. During this period, the Japanese-Soviet conflict was constantly recurring on a small scale. However, Japan, which had entered into an all-out war with China, did not want to have major problems with the Soviets. In July 1938, a major incident took place near the border between the Soviet Union and Manchukuo. It was the Battle of Lake Khasan. Tasanobong, the unit of the battle, was a mountain that the Soviets and Manchukuo mutually claimed as their own territory, and the area was also close to Korea. It was here that Soviet troops began their occupation in July 1938. Initially, the Japanese Chosen Army, which was in charge of defending the area, ignored the Soviets, believing that it was unwise to provoke them. However, the Kwantung Army, taking a serious view of the situation, pressed the Chosen Forces to respond. Upon receiving word of the Chosen Forces, the Japanese government notified the Soviets through diplomatic channels to cease their invasion. However, the Soviets refused to stop their occupation, claiming that the area was their territory. Thus began a full-scale battle between Japanese and Soviet forces over Tasanobong. The battle involved 7,000 Japanese and 23,000 Soviet troops. This battle was the first modern battle since the Russo-Japanese War, in which the Japanese army had not experienced fierce fighting in World War I. Based on the experience of the Russo-Japanese War and the Siberian invasion, Japan had a low opinion of the Soviet army. However, the Soviet forces mobilized this time were highly mechanized. The Japanese forces fought against the mechanized army despite their small numbers, and reached the ceasefire negotiations with Tasanobong defended to the death. The Japanese military leaders were astonished at this mechanized Soviet army, because the Japanese military had not made any significant progress in equipment since the Russo-Japanese War. The reason for this was, of course, financial, but also because the main enemy at the moment was China, which could be adequately fought without mechanization. Quantity was more important than quality. In order to wage war against the vastness of China, although it was the Joseon forces that fought this battle at Tasanobong, the Kwantung Army, which was right beside them, was in great disbelief that the Japanese Army Central Department had followed a policy of non-expansion of the front. In 1939, General Kenkichi Ueda, Commander-in-Chief of the Kwantung Army, formulated the Kwantung Army's own guidelines for handling disputes on the Soviet-Mongolian border. The contents of this outline stated that in areas where the border was unclear, the Kwantung Army Commander-in-Chief himself would draw the border. If any enemy crossed the border, the Kwantung Army commanders would fight regardless of the number of troops they had and always win. The Kwantung Army, which had fewer troops than the Soviets, believed that a resolute attitude would lead to border stability. Of course, this view differed from that of the Japanese government and army leaders. However, even after hearing the Kwantung Army's determination, the army leadership did not issue any specific instructions. This was the reason why the Kwantung Army decided to fight the Soviets in Nomonhan. In 1938, the Kwantung Army requested the addition of a new division to deal with the growing Mongolian-Soviet border conflict. This was the 23rd Division. The Japanese Army, which had already entered the Sino-Japanese War, was chronically short of personnel. Therefore, this newly established 23rd Division was a second-rate division composed of reservists and elders and given outdated equipment. This division of 14,000 men was to defend the vast Mongolian-Soviet border region. They were deployed to the border area in January 1939, and without adequate military training, the military conflict with the Soviets began in April 1939. Although small-scale conflicts had been occurring until then, the military clash on April 23, 1939 was a major event. The Manchukuo Army barracks were burned down by Soviet troops. On May 13, Mongolian troops crossed the border and were fighting with Manchukuo forces near Nomonhan. A telegram was sent to the Kwantung Army headquarters from the 23rd Division requesting immediate dispatch of support troops. The Kwantung Army Command immediately sent out more forces in support than the 23rd Division had requested. The Soviets reacted even more quickly than the Japanese. Upon receiving news of the border clashes, they mobilized 2,300 soldiers, including 13 tanks, 5 chemical tanks, and 39 armored vehicles. In contrast, the Japanese forces numbered 1,700 men, including some artillery. Komatsubara, the commander of the 23rd Division, was misled by interrogations of captured POWs to believe that the Soviets had only about 500 men and some artillery, and that they were fully prepared to fight the Soviets. On May 28, the Japanese and Soviet armies went into battle, with the Japanese having to fight individually and separately on a 30-kilometer front without radio equipment. The same was true for the Soviets, who were forced to fight on their own initiative as their command posts and frontline telephones were cut off in the vast steppe, where there were no targets to be seen. Although tanks were powerful in the unobstructed steppe, the infantry-only Japanese forces repulsed the Soviet attack despite suffering many casualties. However, when Soviet reinforcements arrived on the night of the 28th, the Japanese front line collapsed. Among them, the 157 troops led by Lieutenant Colonel Higashi had suffered 91 casualties. When the 23rd Division's Chief of Staff proposed a retreat, Lieutenant Colonel Higashi was determined to defend this location to the death, since no order had been issued by headquarters to withdraw. He told his men, "It would be a shame if the Japanese army retreated in this first battle against the Soviets. Defend this place to the last man, and we will all meet at Yasukuni Shrine." At that time in Japan, if a person died fighting in a war, he was supposed to be enshrined as a heroic spirit at Yasukuni Shrine. Therefore, when they were ready to die in battle, they would meet at Yasukuni Shrine. This tragic resolve of Lieutenant Colonel Higashi later led to the tragic fate of those commanders who chose to retreat rather than defend themselves. In the evening of the 28th, Kometsubara, the division commander, received a report of the failure to destroy the enemy. Kometsubara was very dissatisfied with the command of Colonel Yamagata, who was the field commander. He questioned Colonel Yamagata greatly about his poor command, but there was no remorse for his own misidentification of Soviet forces and failure to supply sufficient artillery forces. In addition, Masanobu Tsuji, the operations chief of the Kwantung Army, was surprised at the large number of mechanized troops in the enemy forces and the large number of enemy artillery shells. However, he attributed this defeat to the poor cohesion of the 23rd Army and its inexperience in anti-tank combat. He did not reflect on any lack of preparation for anti-tank weapons on the battlefield, which he himself should have done. This bias toward attacks that relied on the mental strength of infantrymen would be repeated in later battles. However, in this first Nomonhan incident, the Japanese forces suffered 290 casualties, while the Soviet Mongolian forces suffered 369. The mechanized Soviet forces suffered more damage than the Japanese. For this reason, the commander of the Soviet forces was ousted. Replacing him was Georgy Zhukov, who had led the Soviet-German war to victory. Then the second Nomonhan incident began. In the next article, I will explain from the second Nomonhan incident. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to our channel and click the like button.